Well, good morning, everyone. We've reached 11 o'clock, so I declare today's housing webinar well and truly open. Many thanks for everyone for joining us today for the first of the Carlis's Building for Renewal housing webinars this year. The theme is Building Back Confidence, Next Steps to Kickstarting and SME Housing Recovery. I've got an excellent panel for you to deliver this, and we'll quickly list who they are, set out housekeeping rules for the day, and really make this a power hour of debate and exchange about the vital role of SME house building. Now, if the national challenge is to get us back building better, then it's also acutely a very local one to restore pre-crisis house building levels and the levels the country needs nationally. And further action is required. It's very clear our major developers will play a huge role in delivering these numbers over time, but for an immediate acceleration, it's to the SME sector that we're going to look. Among issues we're going to raise today are what further measures will be needed to boost confidence, defer immediate costs, stimulate demand, consider the use of the planning system, also maybe consider how we can extend existing house purchase support and encourage new investment through investment and relaxation of SIP rules. Also be looking at what support the SME sector needs, maybe the role for Homes England to accelerate the development finance process, how we can restore confidence through supporting developer cash flow, and how that might look through existing S106 and CIL adaptations and what beyond this. Also maybe looking at how we can make affordable homes viable, especially in more marginal markets, and maybe have a small look at the future homes regulations, how they fit in to integrate that balance between technological development, economies of scale, and land capture. So from the top, I'm Jonathan Warren, Chief Executive of Carlis. So in order to consider all this, how we can really expand the crucial role of SME house builders in filling the cracks in housing provision and creating value, doing their thing differently, we have a wonderful panel. Apologies from Liam Halligan, who's been whisked off to Teesside today for filming. But we, if anyone wants to look into this, Liam's from a SME house building background. His book, Home Truths, is still worthy of a read. But instead, we've got a great panel today. Who do we have? We've got Jonathan Buckwell, Chairman, Developers East Sussex. I've got Mark Curl, Chairman, Essex Developers Group. In alphabetical order, Natalie Elphick, MP for Dover and Deal, and from the Carlis's friends at HFI, this will be going out to parliamentary colleagues one day soon, Natalie, have no fear. Also great pleasure to have Nick Fenton, Chairman of Kent Developers Group, and last but by no means least, because he's going on first, Paul Henry, Chair of the Kent Developers SME Network. So in terms of house rules for today's webinar, I'm going to ask all of our speakers in the turn I call them to set out in 3 to 5 minutes the key issues as they see them in their perspective. Once we've given everyone a turn around, I'll invite questions into the Q&A box and debate amongst the panelists to get the most out of our hour. So, Paul, without any further ado, please unmute yourself, sir, and lead straight in. Thank you.
Yeah, Jonathan, thanks very much for the introduction there. Very, very welcome. Yeah, absolutely. Jonathan's touched on a number of points there, but for me, the key focus really that I'm here to discuss and really want to get some answers to, and certainly representing the Kent SME Developers Network, is if we're going to recover the housing industry and support SMEs, grow SMEs, to come into the market, the biggest and most fundamental issue we all face as SME developers is opportunity for development, which means land availability, and how do we generate more of that for SMEs? Is the system fair? Is there sufficient land opportunity for SMEs versus the big tier 1 developers? I think the system at the moment needs to wake up and change as to that regard. Then once we find ourselves with a fantastic land opportunity, the second part of the challenge is obviously the planning system, which really I'm trying to focus the SME network to encourage and actively engage with local authorities. We hear a lot from a high-level government perspective and MHCLG about SMEs being of national importance, I think was the term. I'd love to hear that coming from a local planning authority as well. And really, let's try and, rather than have a bottom-up approach, let's try and see that top-down so that we've got a good local plan-led system that allows SME developers not only a fair crack at the planning system, but also recognising that importance that we're looking to place on them, particularly for a recovery in the housing market. So for me, if we can square away those two parts in terms of generating land opportunity for SMEs, providing a fair playground, and also then working with SMEs within the local plan-led system, I think we'll be a hell of a long way to ensuring that the SMEs can really deliver on what we say we can.
Thank you very much, Paul, for getting us off to such a strong start. Apologies to Zane, my events coordinator. I always forget this. For those following on Twitter, we do have a great hashtag, SME Builders. Repeat, SME Builders, for anyone who wants to comment this out live on Twitter. Brilliant. I'm next going to invite to unmute Mark Curl to lead on behalf of ESK. Mark, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Jonathan. So I appreciate there are a multitude of issues. I'm just going to try and pick up on a few, and I'm sure my colleagues will pick up on the rest. So just picking up really on Paul's point, the procurement point I think is very important. SMEs generally have lost out in the marketplace due to districts, local authorities that now have their own development companies and no longer looking for SMEs to come in and help develop in areas. We have a number of procurement panels that on the whole SMEs are not included on, and I think we generally have a reluctance in the marketplace for individuals and businesses now to accept SMEs because they are worried about procurement rules and other issues that are going on. We seem to like a one-stop shop, which doesn't suit the SMEs of medium and large sites, seem to be going to one party rather than several. I think a great analogy for me on that is, if we take a 500 unit site with one tier one developer, we are going to be developing what they can sell, which is circa 50 units a year. Becomes a 10-year build program. If we can involve SMEs, we could halve that at least and stimulate the market generally. It's a fantastic opportunity as well for SMEs. We're going into a zero carbon and some other initiatives. Well, there's much more flexibility with the SMEs to come on board on those. So I see that as a great opportunity to bring them into the marketplace generally. It is around the better quality of design that SMEs will bring to the market. It's the quality of production. It's the whole 9 yards of where an SME, I think, just will stimulate the market and make other people think. And that's what this has got to be about, of improving the quality, improving the choices for customers, rather than having a palette of 3 or 4 house types that you can choose from on a site. So I'll hand over to my colleagues.
Many thanks indeed, Mark. Jonathan, if I can ask you to unmute next and add your tuppenny worth. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. So I'm here with a couple of hats, really. I'm here as the chair of Developers East Sussex, and also my day job is very much working for DHA Planning as a planning consultancy, working with a whole range of clients, but SMEs are an important part of that. And of course, SMEs are just more agile than a lot of the larger developers in terms of being able to move forward quickly with sites. And as has been said before, it's really making sure that the planning system can work in the right way to bring the right sites forward in the first place, but then also to get those approvals through quickly enough that the SMEs can actually start building. I think when it comes to local plans, it's important, first of all, to make sure there are those smaller and medium-sized sites in the local plans, rather than relying too much on the larger schemes. We're seeing a tendency in a lot of local plans for these very large developments, garden villages and things to come forward, and they're fine and they have their place, but only as part of a real mix of sites, because it is those smaller sites that will be delivering much quicker and will bring that housing forward. And I think there's also a case just for looking for more flexibility in local plans. I mean, most local authorities, in my experience, tend to go down the route of just allocating specific sites of all sizes. But there are a couple of authorities who do take a more flexible approach in certain settlements, where they may say, well, actually, in these particular settlements, anything adjacent to the existing development boundary, is something that we can have a look at. You've obviously got to make the case for development in that place, but that can be a way of doing it in accordance with the local plan. And I think that sort of flexibility is really important. But then when it comes to actually delivering and getting the planning permissions through, it's just about making sure that that smaller and medium-sized sites are given as much priority through the planning system. I'm hearing of cases where larger developments are knocking the smaller schemes off planning committee agendas, because authorities are concentrating on trying to get the numbers in on the larger sites, because it helps with the 5-year supply and everything else, but it doesn't necessarily help with the fast delivery of those houses. So that's really important. And my final comment, one sort of directed more to SMEs themselves, and that's really a bit of a plea from me, that please get involved in your local developers group. There are groups in this region, in Essex, in Kent, and the one I chair in East Sussex, and they've proved to be a really useful forum, really well attended, with a mix of developers and local authorities, but also we've had good discussions with other key stakeholders like Natural England and Highways England over the last few months. And really, we need more SMEs to take part in those discussions, because groups like this, we really do have quite a lot of influence locally and nationally as well. The three big county developer groups here regularly have discussions with MHCLG and have real influence there. So certainly a plea to get involved and help move things forward that way.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. A strong message for SMEs to get involved. Nick, do you have a few comments to make, please, from your side of the fence?
Of course I do. We talk about the need for SMEs. It's important to recognise why we need SMEs. If we go back in time before the last recession, not the COVID-led recession, but the financial-led recession, a good number, probably about 50% of homes across the area were delivered by SMEs. After the recession, that reduced significantly down, and if we're not careful, it's going to reduce down further. The reason why we need the SMEs to deliver is because they do deliver quality. They usually work in certain areas, local areas, so that they understand the communities that they're working with, and they want to be able to go back there. So they don't want to upset people. They don't want to deliver something that's not going to be acceptable to the local community. And as I say, they like to deliver quality as well. And this must be stressed. This also includes or means S, i.e. small developers, and M, medium size. So that's the regional developers, and we've got plenty across CELEP, as we know, and we need to be encouraging those guys. We need help from the top, right from government down, because as mentioned earlier, it's very easy to pick on the big sites, the big strategic sites, the garden communities, and deliver those, and then say, right, we've delivered our local plan, and we've done it in short style, without really considering what the SMEs need. So we really need something in there to say the SMEs must be listened to, and every time you make a decision, every time you do something, you think about the SMEs. Whether that means deciding what fees are required for planning services, or anything else that goes with it, that we think about the SME developers all the way through. And also encourage the residential providers, the social providers, who are just not interested in some of these small sites. And the SMEs will still really struggle to find a social provider that will actually come along and deliver on the Section 106 of those sites. So it really needs a top-down approach from the districts, from county and from government to make sure that we're actually addressing these concerns and finding the solutions. And that, as mentioned by Paul and others earlier, includes land availability, making sure that that's available. But these guys generally know what they can do within their areas. As I said, they've worked with those communities, so they understand that. And they provide a very valuable service to the development industry.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick, for that. I mean, you mentioned garden communities. Quick plug, this time next week, the CARLIS has its second Building for Renewal webinar on garden cities and communities. Quick plug, Natalie Elphick, MP for Dover and Deal, very grateful to get your views on the role and how we can boost the potential of our SME house building initiative. Please, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm very pleased to be on the session and looking forward to the questions that will follow. It's interesting that that Nick Fenton just mentioned that it needs a top-down approach. My perspective, which has been for a very long time working in and with and across the industry, is that we need a very local and bottom-up approach to solving some of the issues, particularly for ensuring that markets are appropriate to bring forward the right amount of building in the right way. Before I was an MP, I was very much involved in my day job of bringing forward housing and working with people who wanted to do more, and have looked at a number of the government schemes, including in my reviewing capacity on the Elphick House Review, in seeing how they're landing on the ground and whether the schemes that are designed for smaller builders are really delivering what they need to. And I've continued to take an interest in that and in the quality agenda that Nick mentioned as well. And I think for me, there are really three aspects that I've seen particularly impact on smaller builders that I, as I say, continue to pay close interest in. The first is the issue of infrastructure, particularly around the access and the cost of utilities and connections. That can be very, very different depending on the type of developer that you are, and the access and expense, and therefore the ability to bring forward schemes can be very different too. I think making sure that smaller and medium-sized builders are included, and that the larger utilities and infrastructure providers are considering the needs of house building is absolutely critical. I've put forward the case in the past for a consideration of regulatory reform around this issue, and I am keen to ensure that more is done to make sure that connections and infrastructure are brought forward to enable and support house building, not simply that house building should be seen as either the cash cow or the enabler or requirement for infrastructure to come forward in that way. Secondly, moving to funding, and there are sometimes issues around the allocation of available funding, and it is important that smaller builders get the access to the support and funding and structures that are needed. Undoubtedly, some of the national schemes apply and benefit across the board. An example at the moment would obviously be the stamp duty holiday and other national support schemes. But I think undoubtedly from some of the research that I've undertaken over the years, there has been at various points over the last 20 years, quite a lot of focus on allocating funds towards big cities and large towns. And that can mean that particularly rural or coastal areas like my own can then be in a situation where it's difficult to satisfy the criteria and kind of get to the top of the list for some of those fundings streams. I do think that Homes England has done a great deal in this space, and certainly does work very differently and proactively with smaller builders and different areas. But equally, I think that is something that needs to be kept, very close watch on, and make sure that people get the support that they need to bring forward the homes that are needed. And then finally, everyone has mentioned in one form or another the application of effectively one size fits all, both in planning or other policies. It is a continual challenge in getting the balance right between national and local. between that situation of certainty of delivery and certainty of sites that are allocated for planning, and flexibility that enables local businesses to be able to be really innovative and reactive and get things moving on the ground. And I think that is our big challenge, and it continues to be something that has to be brought forward and worked on. I do think that local matters enormously. I do strongly think that there are some excellent examples of local authorities who, whatever is happening in the larger weather of the planning system, are able to work really, really well with developers and get things delivered that work for their communities too. So I think there are some fantastic sort of, best-in-class examples and that applies whatever the particular system is at the time. So it can be done, and it is important that the planning system works to support the delivery at a local level that's right for the sustained growth in the right way of communities. But that is always a challenge because different geographies react and respond in different ways at different paces. And also I would say, particularly in the context of this discussion, that not all SMEs are the same. One of the hats I wear is chair of the New Homes Quality Board, and we're bringing in the New Homes Ombudsman and the New Homes Quality Code for the industry. And I'm acutely aware from the work that I do with that hat on, that it is important to recognise that there is a great deal of diversity and difference within that group that we call the SME sector, and that we need to enable tools and different resources for business support to allow those businesses to grow and prosper within their own geography and in a way that works best for those. But again, I would just underline, I think there isn't one thing called the SME. It's hugely varied, and we need to just be mindful of that when we're thinking and looking for solutions. Otherwise, we fall into the one-size-fits-all trap in relation to SMEs as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Thanks also, Paul, Mark, Nick and Jonathan for getting us off to such a strong start with those opening remarks. So, the Q&A, the chat is open for questions to the panel, to enlarge, expand on the debate. The hashtag for those on Twitter, hashtag SME Builders. Take it away. For the first question, I'm going to pull rank. Councillor James Jamieson, leader of the Local Government Association, has put in a question on housing associations. James writes, interesting point, many councils have their own housing stock and would be able to take on more affordable housing. What do you, the speakers, think of the concept of a council having a standard offer to take on the affordable allocation of smaller sites? Could there be a standard council offer? James also follows up the issue of larger sites not being suitable for SME developers. Many of these are larger sites brought forward by consortium or investors rather than actual developers. Many councils would like local SME developers to take part in these, but would require changes to the planning system to allow local planning authorities to be able to insist that parts of these are sold off in smaller lots to SMEs. So any quick responses to the role of housing associations, and also that follow-up about what to do with larger sites, what councils can do, what they may be constrained from doing under the current planning system. Anyone want to take this? Paul, you've got your hand up looking ready. The floor is yours.
I enjoy this debate because it's one that we really are bringing to the forefront. And Nick touched on it there about RSLs really trying to engage on these smaller sites. And the issue is twofold, being honest, in terms of these small sites. So let's look at the climate before COVID. Small sites in anything less than a 20 to 25 unit Section 106 affordable housing allocation is generally previously unattractive to RSLs for a number of reasons. And we understand the reasons to be management issues generally, but also then does it stack up to their financial models? Since COVID, that issue has been exacerbated, where even if you are borderline with a 20 to 25 unit Section 106 affordable housing application, receiving an offer in your local area is incredibly difficult. So the first thing on a small site, for instance, if you've only got 8 units under a Section 106 affordable housing, the first issue you have is, can you get an RSL to raise their eyebrows or any interest in making an offer in the first instance? The second problem is, when you do have an RSL make you an offer, is it a viable offer? And is it, again, going back to my point of the level playing field that the tier 1 developers receive for their offers, and therefore, in light of those better offers on the tier 1 larger allocated sites, does that make those tier 1s ever more competitive, and therefore, again, cause a greater issue in terms of the SMEs being able to competitively bid on land because of their smaller nature on the Section 106? I do think there are ways in which that can be improved, certainly with local authorities. Local authorities have got ambitions of growing their own affordable housing stock. And if you totted up all of the small sites coming forward in local authorities, less than what I'd like to see coming forward, but let's say there's a fairly significant cumulative number of small sites with smaller allocations of affordable housing, absolutely, I think there's a role for the councils to play to make offers at a viable level. I have to stress that they should be at a viable level. We shouldn't be penalised as SME developers delivering on smaller sites, which are much needed to improve delivery rates, to then be penalised on the level of those offers. So I actually think there is an opportunity for councils, but it's working with those councils and the viability assessments to make sure that they are fair and reasonable offers to bring those sites forward.
Many thanks, Paul. What wants to take us on next? Nelly, over to you. Thank you.
Is this me, Jonathan? This is, I'm unashamedly supportive of councils taking a very strong role in housing delivery and managing housing delivery in their areas. And that's for a number of reasons, but one of them actually is directly in this space, which is that we need to be realistic about the way in which the housing association role has changed over time and the financing and drivers over that. And you know, as a result, there are some areas where the housing association partnerships are incredibly strong and incredibly positive and a real force for good in terms of delivery for both you know, for both mainstream and affordable housing. There are areas which you know, are sometimes referred to as not spots, where housing associations don't want to develop, and those can sometimes be those areas that have more challenging viability or marginal returns, and they don't fit in terms of scale or number with some of those housing association aspirations. Well, in that case, the local authority still wants housing to come forward. Local people still need affordable housing to come forward, and building needs to happen. So it's absolutely, you know, it is vital to understand both where housing associations can help and actually where they're not helping, and therefore a different solution is needed. And just briefly, by way of example, I in the past worked with one particular local authority who had a very, very successful substantial housing association in their patch, and they were building thousands of homes all across the place, huge geography. But in their own backyard, what had happened is when they came up with garage or other smaller infill sites that they wanted developed, they were simply too small for that housing association to bring them forward. And they ended up in a position where they weren't offering them to local authorities to develop, and they weren't offering them to local businesses to take forward either. So that was clearly unsatisfactory all round. I mean, completely understanding that the housing association had made that commercial decision, but also absolutely important that that small builders who are perhaps able to come in and get access to that land and actually bring it forward are able to do so, and that councils have a strong role. So again, back to the one size fits all, we do need to make sure that where there are solutions that aren't working in a particular area, that actually councils and other builders are given the tools and the resources to be able to bring forward the housing that's needed, including affordable housing across the piece.
Many thanks indeed. Natalie, put the same two questions to first Mark, then Jonathan, then Nick.
Thank you. So I think for me, one of the most powerful points that's been said here is by Paul about the level playing field. And one thing we should remember in this is that tier ones on the whole have access to grant directly. So it's one of the issues for SMEs that they are not on a level playing field, that the tier ones in these situations can apply grant. So therefore puts them at a very unfair advantage to the SMEs. And I, for me, that's quite an important part of just trying to level up the playing field.
Thank you, Mark. Jonathan, any thoughts from you on either of the issues or both?
Yeah, I don't have an awful lot more to add on what's already been said on this. I think it's been covered well already. But I mean, just looking at the point, I think what I would stress is the idea of sort of breaking up some of the larger sites. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a role there for SMEs, but I think a lot of it is about making sure that the planning system works well for providing some of the smaller and medium-sized sites in the first place. Those are the ones that communities are often find easier coming forward. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of local authorities doing this very well at the moment. But I do think, rather than necessarily trying to create something artificial that doesn't necessarily work for everyone, it's important encouraging the sites that SMEs do want to bring forward themselves and are in full control of bringing them forward themselves. And that's I think the importance. That's what SMEs want more than anything. I'm not saying there isn't a role for them on larger sites, but we need to focus on bringing those smaller sites forward.
Many thanks, Jonathan. Final word to you, Nick.
Again, thank you, Jonathan. I think a lot of it has been said, but with the RPs, the current white paper suggests that on small sites, I can't remember the number of units, but on smaller sites, there will be no social housing nets and no Section 106 social housing. But we know we need social housing out there, so that's not going to tick the box from both sides. So it has been suggested that we could apply grant to very small sites under 50 units or thereabouts to those, and that would encourage RPs to then respond, and you would certainly get offers, and there would be sensible offers as well if they've got grants to apply to them as well. The districts, their housing departments are also investing in some of these sites as well. We know that in terms of taking on board the Section 106 social housing, and that should be encouraged as much as possible. But some districts are doing it, not all. So we need to find out ways to get others to deliver on those as well. Breaking up big sites is always a very difficult problem because we know that the SMEs will be unable to compete against the larger developers on the site. So they will have to certainly get their quality right, make sure they're producing a niche product to actually compete, but they might be a little bit afraid initially to actually do so.
Many thanks, James and the LGA, for getting us off to such a good start. I'm going to cut and shut a couple of related questions. I've got a question: is there scope for SMEs to help with the delivery of self and custom build? And somebody else asking about opportunities afforded by modern methods of construction, MMC. Any thoughts amongst the panel on self and custom build or MMC in enhancing what SME house builders are able to do?
Yeah, I'll come in there, Jonathan. On just picking off the first part of that question in relation to self-build and custom build. Absolutely. I think what's important to recognise, a few people have mentioned it already, is that SMEs pride themselves on diversification and quality of product, but really then at the same time being community focused and getting to the heart of what the end user wants. There's huge aspirations out there for self-build. The current issues, however, I think, are that the self-build model hasn't yet got the finesse that it requires. It's not, we use this term one size fits all, and I think it's understanding what does the mass consumer, certainly client, what do they want from their self-build? They want flexibility. They want to be able to take forward a site on their own if they feel confident, but at the same time, they want that nurturing wing, if you like, that they don't feel confident that the developer is happy to guide them through the process. I touched earlier on the complexity of the planning system, and we, as SME developers, quite often feel nervous about going into bat on a planning application for a client and an end user. who's never understood planning whatsoever, it's even more challenging. So it's really trying to underpin the confidence and the certainty for the self-builder, give them the confidence to want to take it forwards. I also think it's important that local authorities, they've got ambitious targets. There's certainly a drive from government to really push self-build, but I think it's an understanding of site typologies. What the ambitions are of self-builders more often than not, and certainly what we see and the feedback we receive is not those urban area sites. And therefore, local authorities need to be understanding of where self-build sites come forwards, particularly in the typology of the site, and rural fringes more often than not are the attractive nature for self-build. So I think any local authority that's developing a self-build policy, or certainly custom build, needs to take account of the typology of those sites. Married with that is the sustainability side of things. Obviously, planning is driven by sustainable locations, but at the same time, then it's not that, as I think Natalie mentioned, the one-size-fits-all approach. If we really want to drive forward diversification of product, particularly self-build and custom build, I think we've got to have that balance between understanding site typologies, rural fringes, and really trying to hit that wider market of what people are looking for. But I absolutely think that SMEs can drive forward a movement in the delivery of self-build and custom build because of our willingness to work with clients. And I think Nick mentioned it earlier in terms of our willingness to engage and wanting to deliver a good product, which goes hand in hand with self-build in my view.
Thank you very much, Paul. Anyone, further comments, thoughts on Natalie? Pens up, over to you.
I think we just add on that. I've seen some really good examples of self-build communities, if I call it that, really. And I think that's really can help create something which is a premium bespoke product in the mind of the consumer, and also the consumer being supported through what is a complicated process in many regards, as Paul has outlined. So I think self-build communities are definitely, I think, have been working well. The question around the kind of the one-off bespoke rural fringes fill-in property, I think, is still one, again, which is one of tension between structured planning and reactive or agile delivery on the ground. And I think that debate is still very much ongoing. Specifically addressing the MMC, the picture behind me is not one in Kent. It is one of MMC houses that are now up in Jaywick. And I noticed on the chat that we had some friends from Essex here, so hello to Essex friends, and that was, you know, that first stage has been a relatively small, well, a small number, sort of 10 homes coming on the ground. But in order to bring that forward as an MMC solution, you know, it does take almost as much time to bring forward, you know, 6, 8, 10 as it does to bring forward 50 or 100. And obviously the great benefit from large production MMC is in that name. It's large production MMC. It's being able to deliver at scale and deliver to sites at scale as well. Now, MMC in itself, obviously a huge topic, and again, it's not just one thing. But I would say what I've noticed over the last half a dozen years is that we've seen a confluence of materials being delivered. So we've seen combination materials develop and grow, with people having modular components in more traditional building, and a real change in that methodology that's happened over time. So in terms of large scale MMC, I think the common approach has been to look for larger sites for delivery over sustained periods to support production line. But MMC isn't one thing, and certainly modular components and again, bespoke and supportive solutions can play a really, really important part in getting a range of particularly custom build homes on the ground. So I think MMC continues to be an important part of the discussion, not yet gearing up on the scale that I think many were hoped to see that it would be by now, and that's, you know, that needs more work. but obviously it continues to be a very important part of the dialogue as we continue to get those sustainable high levels of house building across the country.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Mark, Jonathan, Nick, any thoughts your side on self-cut or MMs? Mark, you first.
Thank you, Jonathan. So again, I very little for me to say that hasn't already been said, but I think again it's this flexibility with the SMEs, that they are not as rigid in their structure as perhaps others. It does mean that we can use things like modular construction much more readily. It is around quality, because I think again one of the key, my opinion on this anyway, is it's around quality, that an SME cannot afford to, on the whole, to go back if things go wrong. They need to get it right first time. They don't have a whole customer care team, so it improves what's delivered, in my opinion. You know, some of the best design I have seen in the last few years has all come from SMEs. They are not reliant on the standard house type. Pretty much everything they do is bespoke, and as people have mentioned earlier, they know the areas that they operate in so much better than anyone else, and they deliver the right product first time.
Thank you, Mark. Jonathan, any sort of thoughts, considerations your side?
Not a lot to add to what's been said, to be honest. Only that it's clear that MMC is going to be becoming increasingly important going forward, and it's important that SMEs make the most of that. But you know, as Mark just said, there's clearly opportunities there.
Many thanks. Final word to you, Nick.
MMC is very important. There's no doubt about that. But the SMEs will tend to do what they know they can do well, and therefore they will probably just revert back to course. I know a number of SMEs who are looking at MMC very closely at the moment to see what they can do, and it can be a very quick solution to getting their money back. The developers getting their money back as well. So you know, I think it will happen. The viability side of it is probably not so much of an issue with the SMEs, because they're not buying in the same quantities and with the same economies as some of the tier one developers. So you know, there's probably not such a differential between the costs that an SME will build a traditional type development for against MMC. Jonathan, I'd also bring you to note the comment that's been made by Barry within the questions as well, where he's mentioned about trying to bring in and make sure that the districts are delivering an element or a good quantity of SME sites across the area. And when I mentioned earlier on about a top-down as well as a local approach, which Natalie picked up earlier, that's where the NPPF can actually assist and actually deliver. And that's where I think some amendments could be made quickly that would actually assist the SME developers.
Thank you very much for that round. Another couple of related questions. Always look forward to a question from Brian Horton to our debates. Brian asks, how can we help SMEs to find viable opportunities to deliver affordable housing with the RPs as part of their S106 requirements? And there's sort of a similar question. Somebody comments that they're seeing local authorities putting, in their words, unreasonable S106 obligations on small sites. They don't seem to understand how a site can say less than 50 units can't handle the same burden of administration and cost from S106. So any thoughts about SMEs and S106 from our panelists?
Yeah, I think if I come in on this, I mean, it is so important. Viability is an issue that comes up on so many sites, and it really does vary from one site to another. And I think we've seen a lot of the larger house builders bring forward big schemes on big greenfield sites where viability is much less of an issue. A lot of the sites, certainly that I'm involved with anyway, with some of the SMEs, tend to be the more difficult, smaller sites which have bigger costs in delivering them in the first place. And yeah, well, whereas I think most local authorities that I work with, I would say do understand the viability issues quite well, and do understand what a smaller site can take. That isn't always the case, and it's a particular issue, I think, when it comes to planning committees. And I think there is often a tendency amongst members to, whenever they see a viability argument being put forward, to think, oh, it's just greedy developers trying to get out of paying the money here. And so I think a lot of that is about education and really an understanding. And it's something that we've been doing as part of Developers East Sussex. Is we've had a couple of local authorities approach us to do member training sessions. Where we've and we haven't done it as a case of us going along and sort of giving a lecture on things. We've done in quite a similar format to today, a sort of Q&A session, really, where we've put the questions over to members and said, right, what are your questions? What would you really like to know developers' thoughts on a non-site specific basis? And we found the issue of viability came up quite a lot in the discussion on the member training session we did last year. And so, yes, it is. And I think at the end of that session, a lot of the members just did understand a lot more about the dynamics of it and why sites can or can't afford a certain amount of infrastructure payments to go with them. So it is all about that education for me.
Many thanks, Jonathan. Anyone else like to weigh in on S106? The answer could always be no. Oh, no, thank you.
Yes, please. It comes back to the point I made earlier on. I think when dealing with SMEs, districts, local authorities, local planning authorities need to think SME when they actually get into this. They do not have the departments that the tier ones have, with people just waiting there to actually come in and start to deal with these. They usually have a few directors and maybe one or two admin staff, and that's probably about it. And so it needs to be thinking that these guys cannot actually feel the same reports and other bits and pieces necessary to deal with this. And I think the local planning authorities need to have that in their mind when they address these sites.
Many thanks, Nick. Over to you, Natalie.
Thank you. I think really just to note that the question of viability, I've just seen the comment from Ravi in the chat, and I think it's absolutely right that that high land values can be a challenge every bit as much as low margin areas, and both of those arenas need to be recognised and supported to bring forward the right type of housing and the right spread of participants. And we do need to continue to look at this issue of how we are, for want of a better word, taxing the development industry, and how that money is being actively allocated and spent, and where it is appropriate to be collecting, who's collecting it, and what the cost is. I think one of the areas I've seen over a number of years is a situation where developers make contributions and that isn't actively spent. So, contributions being taken for education, but not actually being immediately invested in education, offers of schools, but then the schools, to build a school, but the school not being required at that point in time, and so on. I mean, I've picked education, but it could be pretty much any of the range of offerings. Obviously, the move to SIL was designed to allow a more active distribution on a planned basis of local infrastructure. But it does seem to me that we need to continue to be looking at this issue, to be making sure that infrastructure is being delivered in a timely and appropriate fashion, but also a recognition that the only source of funding for infrastructure development can't necessarily always be off the back of housing that is being delivered in a locality. Housing is itself an infrastructure social good. We need housing. It makes a really positive contribution to the local and national economy, and I think it's just really important that we keep looking and testing and challenging the way in which this is addressed, and making sure that actually, if contributions are being asked for, that they are both adequate and applied for the purpose for which they are being given. And some studies have suggested as much as 50% of contributions that have been made in terms of committed actually don't make it into the final position. There have been instances where developers have had contributions handed back because they haven't been spent. There have been examples of where much needed infrastructure is required, be it road, be it rail, be it other, and by the time other parts of the environment, be that Network Rail, be that someone else, have actually got their act together to say we can bring this forward, the price of that particular piece of kit has gone out of all proportion and can no longer be delivered, even though it was priced up front and could have been delivered at the time. So I think it's very easy to kind of for it to just be always put in the pot, a new playground, a new leisure centre and so on. I think really testing what's being asked, how it's being delivered and how it's contributing to the sustainable local infrastructure is an important role for everyone involved in the planning process. And that's not to say developers shouldn't be making appropriate contributions. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that we need to make sure that where contributions are asked for, they are proportionate, they're relevant, and most importantly, they're active and applied for the actual infrastructure good of the local community.
Many thanks, Natalie. Now we're in the final sort of 10 minutes now, so really expanding on from, I think, Ravi, these are Wandsworth made a very good comment about how much of a challenge is posed by high land values, which is a key factor in Wandsworth. We had a similar related issue in the Q&A from Tim Wotherspoon asking, do any speakers think that the lecturing review of build out, any of those measures there should have any greater merit in being taken forward? And James Jamison's come up again. Viability is often mentioned, but surely the key is that land price reflects all anticipated costs. So could we support, say, fixed S106 obligations that couldn't be challenged, so there's an even and level playing field? Any thoughts about, further thoughts about cost of land to all of this? Starting with the developers group, so Mark, Jonathan or Nick, would you like to come in on this?
Can I come in there? On that, yes, it will have an effect, but within Kent we have Sevenoaks who have a very high land values as well. Generally that just becomes part of the discussions. Without mentioning any names, when we had one of our cross panel discussions with one of the planning committees in one of the areas, one of the questions they asked is, bearing in mind the high level of experience that you guys have got, how come you get your land viability so wrong so often? That's one that we sort of address fairly quickly, because it's important. Things do change from the point that you start to look at a site to the point that you're actually looking to take it through planning and deliver it. And it's important to reflect that and work on that. When a developer buys a site, they buy it on current costs and current values. They work on that basis. They don't necessarily allow for inflation, because that's just not the way the industry tends to look at things nowadays. So I think it's important that to understand that we don't enjoy having viability arguments, and I certainly don't like paying expensive consultants up in London a lot of money to go and argue a viability that just becomes more inviable. I think it is a part of the industry. And certainly I think the more we can look at that, the better, because it helps. But having high land values is an issue, but they can be generally sort of shown as to be against the market and worked around.
Many thanks, Nick. Mark, Jonathan, any sort of thoughts from sort of Essex, East Sussex as to how this issue affects your areas?
Yeah, and I think just to really echo what Nick's just said. I mean, certainly my experience is very much things do change, and that would be my concern about an idea of sort of fixed obligations. When do they get fixed and how? Because things really do change, and I've seen significant changes in the sort of contributions that are being talked about, even when we go in before an application and we consult with stakeholders before an application is submitted. sometimes, you know, by the time it's being determined, things have changed around completely in terms of what the local need is, for example, for education. You know, one month it may be that that school places aren't needed in an area, and then you know, shortly afterwards things have changed because the study's been updated. So yeah, we do need that flexibility, and as Nick said, developers don't like going back and having to argue these things. As much as anything, it almost inevitably adds significant time onto and delays planning applications being determined. So you know, developers don't generally want to be doing this. They want to be finding a way forward, but ultimately sites have to be viable. If they're not viable, they won't get delivered.
Many thanks, Jonathan. Mark?
I have very little to add that Nick and Jonathan hasn't, but again, I think it's still that point around unknowns at the time of site purchase. Things do change. I personally would probably welcome at least a guidance, so that anyone bidding on land has a very good idea of what that's going to be in the way of contributions from day one. It would certainly help with the negotiations for SMEs with landowners, etc., and would hopefully, maybe in some cases, take away the arguments that go on with regards to viability. But again, that point just goes on with regards to a lot of unknowns, perhaps at the time of site purchase, until investigations and other matters have taken place, and there's a much more firm fix on the design.
Many thanks, Mark. Now, we've got about 5 minutes left, and like in Question of Sports, Mystery Sportsman round, always more questions than answers in our panel debate. So the final question comes from John Beasley, and good question, just to return to the role of local authorities. Now, given the historically low rates available from the Public Works Loan Board, PWLB, what is the view about those councils who are looking to build housing at scale, both within the HRA and more particularly on land owned or purchased by the council itself? Any thoughts about how we can use historic low finance arrangements and how that might impact SME builders? Paul, you're up first. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I'm going to pick off the back end of John's point here in terms of particularly land owned or purchased by the council, and I'd go further than council. I'd go to all public bodies really, so county councils, local authorities, Homes England. I think you can capture them all under this net in terms of low cost financing, but facilitating opportunity. And it was at the outset of my discussion is all about generating land opportunity for SMEs. One thing that we certainly see, and it links back with local plan making, doesn't it? We're talking earlier about large swathes of allocations. More often than not, we see local authorities promoting their own sites, for example, or county council, particularly Kent, for instance, Kent County Council promoting their own sites in local plans. What I'd really love to see is those publicly owned sites working with SMEs in mind. We are very honest and aware that SMEs can't or do not typically deliver sites at large scale, i.e. 400, 500, 600 units for a single SME. We're aware of our capabilities, which small sites I saw in the chat earlier in terms of what would we define as a small site. Or to cater for the S and the M, we would say anything up to 60 to 70 dwellings, because that's when the tier ones tend to come back down to those levels and start competing. So let's call it those sort of numbers. But what I'd really like to try and see is those local authorities that are promoting their own public land, fragment those sites with SMEs in mind. Granted that 600 unit site, you could parcel into 300 units for a tier one, but also then accommodate 6 other SME developers with character parcels within a master plan. That would improve delivery rates, it would improve diversification, it would encourage the tier one developers to enhance their quality if there were a design guide associated with that particular master plan. But it then puts, I go back to the level playing field point, that it generates opportunities for SMEs. Homes England is a great example of that. They're just refreshing their procurement system to go to the DPS rather than the DPP3. And that will then open up opportunities for further SMEs. So yes, I'd absolutely encourage local authorities that own their own land or purchase their own land to work with SMEs in mind to generate land opportunities. And I certainly think that you'd get a far more diverse product, you'd get a better delivery rate, and I think you'd get incredibly good value for money.
Thank you, Paul. 30 seconds each from Natalie and Mark on this issue before we're going to have to wind up today's session.
My 30 seconds, we've seen some local authorities make good use of the low rates of PWLB, but as with everything, it's really important that there is a mixed delivery model across the market and that people know exactly what's required and the risks they're undertaking. There are a lot of good partnerships that can be done in this space to manage and mitigate some of those risks and understand what's happening. That relates not just in terms of physical delivery, but also in terms of financial delivery. So investment and other financial partners, as well as development partners in that space. But clearly, the more that local authorities can play an active role in the housing delivery in their area, then we've certainly seen that a lot can get done.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Final voice from ESK. Anyone to respond on behalf? Mark, thank you.
Sorry, so just again taking the points, I think, you know, any opportunity that could be generated that would stimulate the SME market has to be welcomed. Absolutely has to be welcomed. You know, the point on acceleration, I think, shouldn't be missed here. Any additional units that can be delivered can only be a plus. And part of that is, I suppose the question for me would be, is it going to make others actually improve their standard, improve the variety that they deliver, because they are now competing against someone who is offering that in the marketplace. So I think for me, again, it's definitely a positive.
My first one of 2021. Look, thank you so much, everyone, for participating today. Thank you, Mark, Paul, Jonathan, Nick, and Natalie for joining us, for contributing so richly to the debate. Thank you, everyone, for taking part and for joining us. We will be sending out a letter with a recording of this, so you can pass on to any colleagues who weren't able to catch up with it. Any further questions, come to us at the Carlist. We'll try and answer them, we'll get them answered by members of the panel. But so class over, go back to your next wall-to-wall screens throughout the day. But thank you warmly for taking part and joining with the Carlist for today's rather vibrant session on SME house building. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care now.